This is chapter 5 of The Day We Met the Queen, and this chapter is called Misdirections. In you hop, said Uncle Lenny, opening the back door to his shiny black cab. I love Uncle Lenny's cab because it feels like a mini limousine. It looks small on the outside, but has enough space to fit 7 people inside it, and at least 5 suitcases. And it has lots of buttons and windows and slots and lights as well, so at night it feels like a spaceship. I could tell right away that it had been cleaned especially for today because it smelled like cleaning polish. This is the first time, Ahmet smiled as he jumped into the cab behind me. In home, taxis, they are white. I suddenly wondered what taxis in different countries of the world looked like, and if they were all like mini limousines too. Are you sure you don't want me to come? Asked Mum, patting my hair and smoothing my shirt for the 10th time. I nodded. I secretly wished the Queen had invited all our parents and Ahmet's foster mum and Mrs. Hemsey and maybe even Mrs. Khan to tea, but she hadn't. Instead, she had said there were going to be 2 special guards to meet us at the entry door and that whoever was with us could wait in a waiting room. I didn't want Mum to come to the palace and not be able to go in with me. It would feel worse than it did saying bye to her from outside our home, so we both agreed she would stay behind. Don't speak unless you're spoken to, darling, shouted Tom's mum as she shut the door after us. She gestured to Uncle Lenny to buzz down the window and continued, Remember, she's the Queen. She's the Queen of England. She's not like your Aunt Macy. Michael, remember, do not ask the Queen about how you can access the MI6 building, said Michael's dad. Ahmet, don't make the Queen smell the rucksack, okay, darling, said Ahmet's foster mum, waving. Just show it to her. Remember to have fun, kids, JC's dad smiled. Her mum started to cry, muttering, I can't believe my baby's off to see the Queen. Never in all my life. I looked at Mum and waited for her to say something, but she just pushed up her glasses and gave me a wink, as if to tell me that no matter what I did, she would be waiting to hear all about it when I got home. The wink made me miss my dad and made my nose tickle, so I winked back with both my eyes, one after the other. Seatbelts on? Asked Uncle Lenny. We all gave him a thumbs up. Good, then off we go. As we swerved away from the pavement and waved bye to our mums and dads, Michael, whose seat was facing the back, twisted around towards Uncle Lenny's special glass window and shouted, Mr. Lenny, sir, can you put the meter on? Michael, mate, you don't need to shout, said Uncle Lenny, laughing, and then looking into his special mirror, he frowned at us through his reflection and asked, Why do you want the meter on? Michael shrugged and said, So I can watch the numbers go up and see how much money it would have cost if we were paying. Uncle Lenny laughed and tipping his cap and said, Aye, aye, Captain, and switched on his money box. That's the box that every taxi that has to count how much a driver is owed. In most taxis, the numbers are red, but I told my Uncle Lenny that it looked scary, like the numbers that you would see on a bomb in a big action movie. So he managed to change the colours from his box to yellow. Michael watched for a moment until the numbers changed from £2.50 to £3. Then he gave a big sigh and smiled, looking happier than I'd ever seen him. Taking a journey in a black taxi from one part of London to another is fun when you're on your own, but when you're with your very best friends wearing your most favourite clothes and the driver happens to be the very best uncle in the world, it makes the journey even more exciting. Even the boring parts of the city that you can see every day change shape and become shiny and new, as if they secretly belong to a brand new city that you can only ever see when you're sitting behind a different window. We all giggled and pointed and poked each other in the arm as Uncle Lenny drove us past houses that got bigger and redder and taller, and shops that shone with more and more lights. The numbers on Uncle Lenny's meter got higher and higher until it reached exactly £52.40, and the cab slowed down and came to a stop. Hold up, what do we have here then? Asked Uncle Lenny, looking around. I looked out of our window and shook Tom's knee. I knew where we were. We were near the palace. Up ahead was the huge arches crossing the large red road that we had walked through just 2 weeks ago, when we had been out on a completely different and far scarier adventure. Someone tapped on Uncle Lenny's window. We all leaned over to see who it was. It was a police officer with a helmet on her head and dark brown eyes. "Sorry, sir, but you won't be able to turn here," she said, pointing in the direction of a long line of police who was standing across the road. "There's a protest, so the road has been blocked." "This is like the last time," whispered Tom, looking worried. "I see that," said Uncle Lenny, "but these children here have an appointment with the Queen." The police officer tilted her head to one side. "Have they now?" she asked. We all nodded as Ahmet pulled out his invitation to show her, pushing it to Uncle Lenny through the slot where people usually put their money. "He says it is real, from the real Queen." Uncle Lenny handed the police officer the invitation. She read it, smiling a little bit. This is what Ahmet's invitation looked like. The Lord Chamberlain is commanded by Her Majesty to invite Ahmet Sakel, the bravest refugee boy I know, to a special afternoon tea at Buckingham Palace on Saturday the 27th of October at 12 noon. This card does not guarantee admittance. "They're meant to be at the East Gate in 10 minutes, explained Uncle Lenny, looking at his watch nervously. The police officer nodded and, turning away from her, started speaking into the walkie-talkie that was taped to her bright yellow police jacket. "What if they don't let us through in time?" whispered Josie. Grabbing the end of the plait her mum and dad had made her to put her hair into again, she tried to pull it into her mouth. "Here you go," said the police officer, poking her head through the window and giving Ahmet back his invitation. "You can head on down to the East Gate, but you're going to have to leave the cab here, I'm afraid. The crowds are a little too thick for a vehicle to get through. So instead, Officer Jensen and Officer Wu will be escorting you." She pointed over her shoulder to two officers in bright yellow jackets and waved at them to join us. "All right," said Uncle Lenny. "Where shall I park up?" "Just leave the vehicle here," said the police officer, pointing to a spot right beside her. "And Mr. Ahmet Sakel?" We all looked at Ahmet, as Ahmet looked up at the police officer. "It's a pleasure to have met you." And with a tap of her helmet, she smiled and waved us through the long line of officers standing behind her like a human wall. Ahmet went bright red, and smiling with all of his face, he put his invitation carefully away again in his rucksack. "Come on, kids, we best hurry," said Uncle Lenny as he parked the cab, and Officers Jensen and Wu joined us. Officer Jensen was very tall and pale and almost had as many freckles as Josie, and Officer Wu was skinny with shiny black hair and had a frown that was as deep as a miniature ditch on his forehead. "Right, kids, look like we might have to run," said Officer Jensen as Uncle Lenny swung open the car door and grabbed my hand. I jumped out and everyone else leaped out behind me. "Join hands and don't let go," instructed Officer Wu, walking in front of us. "Follow me, please." We all joined hands and began to walk as fast as we could down the large red road towards the palace, looking like a short and bobbing snake. Both Officers Wu and Jensen kept on waving at us from the front as they shouted, "Make way, please, make way," to the crowds around us. But as we got closer and closer to the large black gates of the palace and the huge water fountain that lay in the middle of the road, it got harder and harder to see Officer Jensen, even though he was so tall. There were so many other police officers everywhere, and so many people with cameras and bags and prams and cards, and so much noise that we kept on having to let go of each other's hands and quickly join up again to make it through the crowd. But then it got even harder to do that too. "Try to keep up," cried out Officer Wu as Uncle Lenny let go of my hand and waved at us to walk closely in a line behind him instead. But the crowds were getting taller and squashier and louder, and within a few seconds I couldn't see the top of Uncle Lenny's head anymore, or Officer Jensen's helmet, or Officer Wu's bright jacket. All I could see were people's coats and trousers and shoes, and all I could hear were people shouting about refugees and how they weren't welcome, and how they were and how they weren't. I looked behind me to make sure that everyone was still there, but all I could see was Michael pushing up his glasses and struggling to keep up with me. I turned around to tell Uncle Lenny to ask the officer to slow down, but he was gone. That was when I heard someone shout, "Look! It's him! It's that refugee kid, Ahmet!" Instantly everyone turned around to look and shout and point. I stopped and hopped around to try and see where Ahmet was to make sure he was okay. Michael joined me, and then so did Josie and Tom, but we couldn't see Ahmet anywhere. And just then someone else shouted, "Here! Those are his friends!" The crowd around us shuffled and pointed and stared at us as cameras clicked and my breath began to feel squashed. Some of the faces around us were frowning and angry, and they were holding up the horrible signs I had seen on the news. They got closer and closer, pinning us into the middle of a circle, when suddenly Josie gasped. I looked over my shoulder in the direction she was staring and saw what had made her go white. Through a small gap in the crowd, I could see Ahmet, who was standing about 10 steps away. He was nearly surrounded by another crowd, but he wasn't alone. He was staring up at a man, and the man was holding Ahmet's red rucksack, as if he was trying to stop him from running away. I knew right away who the man was by his dark blue suit and the golden ring he was wearing on his little finger. It was the Member of Parliament, Mr. Fry. But it wasn't seeing him that made me suddenly feel as if my hands and feet had frozen. It was seeing the man next to him. A man with a long face and a long nose and long lips and a large brown bristly moustache. It was Mr. Irons, the strictest, most horrible, most hated teacher who had ever taught at our school. Michael and Tom had seen him at the same time. They gasped as Josie cried out, "What's he doing here?" We all stared at Mr. Irons. He had helped Brendan the bully get away with hurting Ahmet, and now he was here, smiling down at Ahmet as if he had just been given the world's best birthday present, and making my insides feel like jelly and fire all at the same time. And without thinking or being ready or knowing what I was doing, I felt my legs push against the ground and my arms push everyone around me away, and my voice cry out, "You leave him alone!" And for a few seconds everything seemed to stop. I had reached Ahmet and MP Fry and Mr. Irons, and I'd heard the footsteps and breaths of Tom and Josie and Michael as they came up behind me. I reached out and touched Ahmet's arm so that he knew I was there with him. My heart was marching through my head, and my stomach felt like it was an ocean full of crashing waves, but I didn't care. We stood and stared up at MP Fry and Mr. Irons and all the people around them who were staring back at us, and waited for whatever was about to happen next. But as we waited, from somewhere in the distance a clock struck 12. Something heavy dropped in the ocean in my stomach and sank to the very bottom. Because I knew right away that we weren't ever going to get to the Queen on time, or to get to ask her our 10 most important questions.